Welcome back to Hobby Basics. I'll be your instructor, Dana Howell, and today we will finally be talking about applying some base color coats to your models. For those of you just joining us, Hobby Basics is an online learning series geared towards teaching you the fundamentals of the miniature painting hobby in the format of a college-level art class, giving you knowledge, demonstrations, as well as assignments to practice your skills between classes. Because we're going to be covering so much in Hobby Basics 103, I've decided to split it into two halves, Hobby Basics 103A and Hobby Basics 103B. In 103A, we're going to be covering applying some basic coats of color to your model while preserving the undershading that we've already done. In 103B, we're going to be covering everything to make the model look finished, such as additional shading, additional highlights, and other details. If this is your first time watching, I would encourage you to start at the beginning, as each class builds upon concepts established in the previous one. If you're watching this class on YouTube in the year 2020, I'll be linking a full playlist in the description up here, as well as down in the description. With all that out of the way, let's begin. For today's class, you'll need the following supplies. You will of course also need access to all the supplies that we have accumulated up until this point in our tutorials. For class 103B, you're also going to need Agrax Earthshade from the Citadel Shades range. But if you want and you haven't bought it yet, you won't need it for part A of the tutorial. At the time of this video, these supplies should cost you about $30 in USD, or approximately 40 cubits of Canadian maple syrup rations. But if you already have some of these supplies, feel free to use the ones that you have, or buy them from a local craft store or hobby store. In our last video, I showed you that we typically never want to use paint straight out of the bottle unless we're dry brushing. In general, we want to thin down our paint with water a little bit so that it flows better onto the model and so that the layers of paint do not get too thick. But actually, I wasn't being entirely truthful. Today we are going to revolutionize the way you paint by introducing the concept of thinning your paints with glaze medium instead of water, which, when I am applying paint with a brush, is what I tend to do by default. I've done a few other videos on glazing already, and you can feel free to check those out if you like, but today I'd like to approach the subject from a slightly different angle. Acrylic paint is made up of 3 different ingredients. Pigment, which is like Kool-Aid powder. Basically, it's like color powder that determines the color of the paint. Water, which is what makes these water-based paints. And finally, acrylic, which is sort of plastic goo, which makes it gooey instead of the consistency of Kool-Aid. As we go forward, I would like to ask you to keep these 3 ingredients in mind, as paint is not just one thing, but a chemical mixture of these 3 ingredients. In class 102, we thinned our paints with water, and we saw that when we added too much water, the paint would break down and slowly become a mess. When we thin our paints with water, we are thinning our paints, which is what we want, but we are also decreasing the amount of the other 2 ingredients in the mixture, which can break down the paint's chemical makeup. So you may ask, what can we do about this? We want thin paints, but we don't want paints that are going to become runny or are unusable. We don't want to be painting with Kool-Aid, although that would be a very interesting video, and I might have to put that in my back pocket for later. Essentially, there are a few different solutions, and I'm going to give you one solution today to how to thin your paints. This is thinner medium. It is composed of water and acrylic, so it's like a paint without the Kool-Aid powder. You can add any sort of color you want to this, but it's by default just going to be a transparent paint. So if you wanted to, you could add some of this to your paint and it would thin it down. So why isn't this on the supply list? Well, there's a very good reason for that. Because in almost every case, this glaze medium is going to be superior to this. I don't think that we actually know the exact chemical makeup of either of these, but most people would tell you that this is just this, but with 2 extra ingredients, flow improver and drying retarder. Flow improver is going to, as it suggests, help your paints flow better, and drying retarder is going to increase the drying time of your paints, giving you more time to move it around on the figure before it finally dries. So this is just a more flexible compound. If you cannot find this in your local store or online, thinner medium will work though. So you can still do these techniques using thinner medium if that's all you can find. But if you can find it, I would encourage you to find some glaze medium. On my last big video about glazing, a lot of people made the comment that can they use a matte medium instead of glaze medium? This is a common misconception. You're thinking of gloss medium. So this is a matte glaze medium. Glaze and gloss are similar in terms of which word they are, so I do understand the misconception, but this is a matte glaze medium. So your paints will dry in a matte finish. So with all of that out of the way, let's go to the desk and actually put this stuff into action. Before we start, I just want to show you a little bit about how we are going to use glaze medium. So we're going to start by using our new color, Vallejo Blue Green, and we're going to use our glaze medium. We're going to shake both of them up really well, and then we're going to start by putting a drop of each onto our palette. Using our mixing brush, we are just going to mix this together to create a slightly more transparent version of the paint we were already using. So you can see when I take this, it has pretty much the consistency of regular paint, but it is slightly more transparent. Now, the more glaze medium you add to the mixture, the more transparent your color is going to become, and the less that you add to your mixture, the less transparent it's going to become. So if we want the paint to be less transparent, we can add a little bit more of the blue-green, and if we want the paint to be more transparent, we can add a little bit more of the glaze medium. I'm going to just use the medium as is, or the mixture as is, and we're going to take a little bit on our brush, making sure not to get it into the ferrule of the brush, and then we're just going to wipe off a little bit on our paper towel. You can see I'm just letting the paper towel absorb any excess moisture, which is an important part of this step. Just using our brush, lay down a little bit of the blue paint. Now you can see that, or I don't know if you remember when we were working with paint mixed with water, it had a very different texture than this. Glaze medium maintains the texture of regular paint, so it applies to your models really well, and it's also going to show through the colors underneath really well. So you're getting this really nice bright blue because we put a lot of white underneath it. If you were to put some of this paint onto a darker part of the armor, let's say this little dark part under here, you can see it really reflects what's underneath it. So we're preserving the kind of undercoat of our colors. Again, if we want it to show through more of the colors underneath, all we have to do is add more glaze medium to make it more transparent. So you can see it is showing through a little bit of what's underneath, and the colors are nice and vibrant. So now I'm just going to go through and apply thin coats of this color to all the parts that I want to be this blue-green color, which is pretty much most of the armor, all of the armor parts that aren't going to be metallic or white, basically. It's a fairly straightforward part of the paint job. As you practice, you're going to get a feel for how much glaze medium you want to add. Generally, the more transparent your colors are, the more control you're going to have, but also the more coats you're going to have to do. So if you want to work a bit quicker, you can add less glaze medium and keep more paint. You can see I'm not really using a very small brush to do this. As I think I said in the last part, you don't really need a small brush. All you need is a brush with a good point. The thing about a glaze versus a wash is that it usually doesn't fall into the crevices. And it dries relatively slowly, so you have some time to move around the pigments on the surface with your brush. Again, if you're speed painting, you don't have to work with a glaze that's this thin. but we're going fairly slowly today. For some of these details, we're just going to use the edge of our brush. Like I said, it's like a coloring book now. You can really easily see where the dark lines should be. You just put color in between them, and your shading is already done for you. We're just building it up slowly. It's looking good. And in some places, we're going to apply a second coat if the color is not vibrant enough. Here on the gloves, we didn't quite get all the parts. We can always come back and add another coat later too. The shield could use a second coat. Again, if you color a little bit outside the lines, that's okay because we're going to be going over this again later anyway. What's important right now is just to establish a nice base tone of all the colors. Okay, we just have a few other little details to paint blue and then we can move on. Okay, just in here. There's a few spots underneath here that didn't quite get hit with the primer, but it should be okay to just paint them blue. So that should be enough blue for our model. I think we have covered pretty much all the surfaces we need to in blue. So we can move on to our next color, which is going to be Cavalry Brown. And like our other color, we're just going to put a little drop of it here. And then we're gonna put a drop of our Glaze medium here. And then using our mixing brush, we're gonna mix up the color, making sure that our mixing brush doesn't have too much water on it. So we're going to just take a bit on our brush, wipe off the excess, and we're gonna leave the interior robes white, so it'll just be like red on one side, white on the other side. So I think this is really gonna show through really well over these robes and save us a lot of time highlighting. I want to just apply a nice thin, even coat. It's better to have to do multiple coats and have them all be nice and thin and show through the colors underneath. This is definitely going to require several coats, so take your time with it. This is going to be one of those instances where it's going to be helpful to take off the shield because it's very loosely attached. So I'm just going to take that off. We really didn't get any primer under there, I guess. Should be okay though. And this will allow us to paint the robes all the way around. And we might actually put some blue under there too, on the parts we missed before. And this is going to look really good when we're done. Really nice even coats. If you make any mistakes at this stage, don't worry about it because we are going to do a lot of cleanup later. I'm also just going to line this edge with some red so that it's barely visible on the other side. Just provides a nice little bit of detail. So just using the edge of our brush, we can easily do this. While we're under here, I'm just going to take a little bit of our blue paint and finish up the armor under here that we weren't able to see before. Now you can see that the coat on the back here is a bit uneven still, so I think I'm going to apply a second coat of the red to the robes before we move on. So as you can see, not a lot of our underpainting is showing through on the red parts, but it doesn't always work with every color. You can see it's really helped the armor, the blue armor, be very vibrant, but the robes not so much. But that's okay. You kind of win some and you lose some. One of the reasons I picked this color of red was because it's fairly desaturated, meaning it has less white and more black in it. It's a darker tone of red to help contrast the really bright, hyper-saturated blue-green that we're using on the armor. I think it provides a nice contrast. So our base tone is looking pretty good. And the next thing we're going to do is just paint all of the extra little leather bits with our red color. So let's start with the leather straps right here. And we're going to give these a slightly different treatment later on to make them look more like leather. But for now, we're just going to paint them the same red color as the robes. And we're also going to carefully use the side of our brush to paint the belt in here, as well as the straps on the crystal. And the belt along the back as well. It's looking good. And then we're also going to paint the leather handle on the weapon. Okay, that's looking good. All right, so for our next color, in line with our ethos of making sure it is always done at each stage, we're going to tackle the largest surface areas first. So that means I want to paint the base because it's going to make the whole thing look more finished, and also it doesn't really matter what order we do this in. So we're going to do the base next. So in order to do that, I'm thinking that the base is mostly stone. So I would like to paint it a dark blue color. It's going to come off as kind of gray, but this is my example figure where we've painted it sort of a very dark greenish blue. So in order to do that, we're going to mix these two colors together to get that color. This is blue-green and black-gray. So we're going to mix up our colors, and we are going to put a little dot of each one on the palette. Okay. And to this mixture, I'm going to actually add a little bit more glaze medium. So I think I'm going to add 4 drops. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the reason for that is it's such a big surface that I kind of want it to act a little bit more like a filter or a wash rather than being such a solid color. So we're going to try that and see what happens. Where's my mixing brush? So using our mixing brush, we are going to mix up our color like so. What we're going to end up with is this sort of color, which is kind of a fun color. Anyway, I'm also going to add a little bit of water to the mixture just to thin it out a little bit more. And then we're going to clean off our brush. And then using our large detail brush, we're going to proceed in the same way that we do everything else. Go a little bit on our brush, wipe off the excess, and then we're just going to paint the base. You can see it's a little bit more transparent as we intended. Oh, actually, if we wanted to make this easier, that was one of the reasons we didn't glue her on there. You can just really go to town on this. So we'll probably do about 2 coats of this color. Some people like to leave the bases for last, but I kind of like to do them somewhere in the middle because I feel like it helps the figure look complete. And also it's such a large part of the figure that it helps you see what the final figure is going to look like. So you can adjust all the other colors as necessary. So while we're waiting for that to dry, we're going to take our figure and use this same color to paint a few of the other parts of the figure. The first thing we're going to paint in this color is her gloves, and it's going to be a lot easier to do this because the figure is already in pieces. So using the same technique as before, we're going to carefully cover all of the parts of the gloves in this same dark blue-green color. You also probably want to be a little bit careful here. We don't usually like to be handling the figure without any sort of stand or whatever, because there's a chance we could get fingerprints all over it. But if we're a little bit careful, it should be fine. Or if you want to, you could mount the pieces separately with blue tack and then paint them that way. So while we're waiting for the gloves and the base to dry, we can paint the rim of the base. And for this, we're going to use a 1-to-1 mixture of black gray and our glaze medium. So then we're going to take that mixture, wipe a little bit off on our paper towel, and then using the edge of our brush, we're going to carefully paint the rim of the base. You can see here why it's especially helpful to have our base mounted on some sort of block of wood or handle of your choice. So we might add more coats to the base or the rim of the base later, but for now, let's move on to the other parts of the figure. So we're just going to mount our figure back on the base, and at this phase, we really only have a few more things to paint that are non-metallic. We really just have the skin and the crystal on the side of the model, and everything else is going to be metallics. So I think we're going to paint the skin next. So similar to before where we used the blue and darkened it with black, we're going to take our cavalry brown and mix it with black gray. So, but it's going to be a slightly different mixture. So we're going to use 2 drops of cavalry brown, about that much, and we're just going to darken it with 1 drop of black gray, and then 3, maybe 4 drops of glaze medium, and a little bit of water. Should give us the color we're looking for. Might want to add a little bit more black. Yeah, I think we need to add maybe 1 more drop of black. There we go. That's the skin tone I'm looking for. So what we're left with is a nice dark skin tone. We're going to use that to paint the face. I'm not going to talk too much about painting skin in this video because it is sort of an advanced topic. But in a future episode of Hobby Basics, we will be dedicating a lot more time to skin tones. Because there's not a lot of skin showing on this model, we're just going to keep it fairly simple and glaze on a little bit of this color to start with. In 103B, we might go back and add further shadows and highlights, but for now, we're just going to apply a few coats of this glaze color. I'm also noticing, I hadn't noticed this before, that there is actually a little bit of cloth in there. So I'm thinking maybe we paint that in our cavalry brown color, a nice red color. So using some of the red color we already have on our palette, we're just going to carefully paint the collar around the headpiece. So the final thing we want to paint before we get into our metallics is the crystal on the side of the hip. In order to do this, we're going to use 1 drop of our blue-green, 1 drop of our pale sand, and 2 drops of our glaze medium. This will help to create a lighter blue color than the armor blue color. So we're just going to take a little bit of that color on our brush, wipe off the excess, and then we're just going to carefully apply it to the parts of the crystal that we want to be this color. There we go. We can see it is now a bright crystal color. So there are a few, you can see there are a few parts of the model that could use a second coat, like the base, the rim of the base. But I think I would like to move on in order to obey our law of always done. We're going to move on to the metallics, and then we can always return later and add more coats to any parts of the model we feel need extra coats of color. So before we paint our metallics, we're going to want to use a different glass of water. So for me, I'm using a pickle jar to differentiate from the jam jar. And you can see why here. Metallic paints leave this metallic residue. And if you're using the same water jar as your normal paints, all of your paints are going to slowly start to look metallic because the metallic flakes are going to get mixed in with your paints and your water. So we're going to use a separate jar for our metallics, and we're also going to use a separate brush for the same reason. If you do not have a separate brush, if you only have one brush that kind of has a fine point on it, then that's okay. Just make sure to wash it really thoroughly before you switch back to non-metallics. But because our brush pack came with an extra brush with a good point on it, we're just going to use this as our metallic brush. All right, so we have two metallic colors that we bought. The first is Vallejo Metal Color, which is a really nice metal color paint. It has a ball bearing inside to help you mix it. So this is kind of, in my opinion, the highest quality metal paint you can get. And I highly recommend, this is probably on my list of like top 10 paints that you should own. That's why it's included in the basics. And then we also have Vallejo Game Color Glorious Gold. So the reason that I haven't recommended two of the same brand is because the gold metal color tends to be harder to find in my area. So I didn't want to recommend something that was going to be hard to find. And also, if I had recommended two of these metal colors, it would have been much higher. It would have broke our budget because these are like $10 and these are like $3. So I figured this was the more useful one to have. We use silver more often than we're going to use gold. So this is still a good paint, but it is a lower quality, not really like a true metallic to something like this. If you do want to spend the extra money, I guess that's what I'm saying, is if you don't care about the budget and you can find the gold metal color in your area, feel free to use that instead. But this will work just fine as well. This is probably my favorite metallic in the Vallejo range. All right, so moving on. We probably want to, for the same reasons as the water glass thing, we want to reserve a special spot on our palette for metallics to make sure that they're not mixing in with the other colors. And yeah, let's do the silver first. So this paint is a very different formula than other paints that we're used to. I don't know exactly how it's made, but it is, I mean, you can see how different it is. You don't really need to thin it down. It has an interesting consistency to it. So we're just going to take a small amount on our brush, making sure not to cover the brush in it. And we're going to paint the weapon with this color. Most metallic paints are going to want to thin down quite a bit, but again, that's one of the advantages of metal color. I think they really are considered by a lot of people to be the best metallic paints that you can buy. And I would have to agree. But they are quite expensive, which is why we only included one in our list. So we're just going to do a very thin coat of our metal color all over the end of the weapon. Just using the edge of our brush, I'm going to paint these beads silver. And the lightning bolt silver. And moving on to the shield, I'm going to paint the anvil here silver. And then we're going to paint the lightning bolts underneath here silver. I'm realizing on camera it might just look white, but the anvil is silver. It'll come across more, you can see it there in the reflection. And maybe this little part will paint silver as well. Knob of the hammer. Okay, so there actually is not a lot of silver on this model, but it's still good that we have that silver paint. We're going to use it for some highlights later. And it's going to come in very handy on every single model we paint in this series. And if you're painting one of the Stormcast with the helmet on it, you might want to paint... Oh wait, never mind. Sometimes I like to paint that little anvil silver. Okay, so now we're going to use the gold, which works a little bit differently. So this paint is a bit thicker. The metallic chunks are a bit thicker. So what we're going to do is we're going to thin it down a lot before we use it. The reason for this, I'm just going to put a little bit on our palette. The reason for this is that it's very easy for metallic paint to come off as looking very chunky. So that's why we've done all of our white undershading, and we're just going to apply like almost a metallic glaze. I mean, literally a metallic glaze. We're making a glaze on top of the parts we want to look gold. I guess we'll just use this as our mixing brush as well as our painting brush. Yeah, it's okay. All right, so you can see it looks quite different. It is, there's basically like little pieces of glitter in here. So we need to be careful to not lay it on too thickly. I would say with working with these sorts of metallics, it's always better to thin down more and then add more thickness if you need to. Okay, so because this is the leader model of the unit, she's gonna have a golden lion on her pauldron on the side here. So like the other paints, take a little bit on our brush. We're gonna wipe off a lot of it. We're just gonna gently apply the gold, taking care not to let it get too thick in any one area. So we'll just do the same on the back and everywhere that needs to be gold. We want to just apply a gold filter, letting the brightness of the undershading show through. And we're going to apply a few coats to this. Now that that shoulder's done, we're going to move on to the other shoulder. So the middle part is going to stay white, and we're going to paint the edges in gold. And we're also going to paint the hammer insignia here in gold. And then the front. You can see the gold really helps bring the whole model together, starting to really look finished. Okay, so next we're going to paint this part of the weapon in gold. Of course, these are your models, and if there's any of these parts that you want to paint in different colors, feel free to. This is just the scheme I've come up with for my Stormcast. So if you'd rather paint this part silver and not gold, it really is up to you. You can do whatever you like. This is just one example of a way that you might paint a Stormcast. All right, now for the other side. We're going to carefully paint this gold without getting any on the hair. Haven't decided yet what color I want to do the hair. We might do like a black or gray, or maybe just leave it white. I don't know. see how it looks with all the other colors, and then we can decide what color to paint her hair. And we're going to paint some parts of her prayer beads in gold. And then also this anvil we're going to paint gold as well. All that remains we're going to paint this little lion in gold, and then we're going to paint parts of the shield gold. Oh, and this little knob, we want to paint that little knob in gold. So we're going to do that quickly. At this point we've added gold to all of the parts that we want to be gold on the shield, down here on the knee, the knob here. And I think I might go through and add a second coat of gold to a few of the pieces. Just touch up a few of these parts. So generally about 2 coats of gold should be good, 2 thin coats of gold. And oh, and I wanted to paint the stopper on here gold, so we can do that really quickly. Yeah, wanted to paint that part gold. Might need a few coats because there's a bit of blue underneath it. Okay, so you can see here what it looks like when we've added 1 to 2 coats of gold on all of the parts of the model that we want to be gold. Now I think what we might want to do at this point is paint the inside of the shield. But before we do that, I think we probably want to let the model dry a little bit, so I don't want to get my fingerprints on the gold parts. So maybe while we're waiting, we can put some extra coats of color on a few of the other parts of the model we might want to have color. So switching back to our non-metallic brush and our non-metallic jam jar, I think what I want to do is actually paint, now that we're kind of at the finishing stages, I'm noticing these beads aren't really contrasting very well. The silver beads here work okay because they're smaller, but because they're so prominent here and they're not really contrasting against the white, so I'm thinking it might look nicer to paint these in red. So I think I'm going to go back and paint these beads in red while we're waiting for the gold to dry. And then I think I might add another coat to the base color and the base rim color. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do now that our model has had a little bit of time to dry is to paint the inside of the shield. So here's how we're going to do that. I'm going to carefully take this off of here. I'm going to carefully separate this. And then we're going to carefully, trying not to get any of our fingerprints on it, separate these parts. And then we are going to stick this right here. And there we go. We may have to do some touch-ups later, but I think that's the best we're going to do in terms of being able to paint the inside of the shield. Okay, so I think I'm just going to paint the inside of the shield a gray color because we don't want to draw attention to it. It'll look like it's shadowed. And let's do that. We'll mix up a little bit more of our gray color and glaze medium. And then we're just going to apply 1 or 2 coats to the inside of the shield. If you want to, you could paint parts of it silver, like the little knob, but honestly, no one is going to be looking inside of the shield, so I think as long as it's a nice dark color, that's probably all you have to do to make it look good. Okay, we might go back and add some paint to the edge here. I think painting this part blue would look good. But yeah, as you can see, that's probably good enough. While we're waiting for that to dry, I think I have decided I want to paint her hair this same black-gray color. So we're just going to gently do that right now, letting a few of the highlights show through. Looks good. So after adding a few little coats and a few extra coats and little details, we are basically done all of the base colors. The difference between this one and this is that on this one we've added a whole bunch of washes and highlights, and I've decided after much deliberation to actually split up this into a second video so that I can get these hobby basics videos done a lot faster, and you can start painting all of the base colors while I work on the next video, which will be about washes and highlights and getting all of these nice metallic effects using washes and highlights and stuff. So yeah, you can look forward to that. Today we learned how glaze medium works, how to apply color to our models, how to work with metallics and how their consistency can be different from regular paints, and that's it. In 103B, we're going to be covering some additional shading, additional highlights, as well as some final details, so your Stormcast will be complete. You won't need any additional supplies for 103B aside from that Agrax Earthshade if you put off buying that for this class. Your homework for today is to base coat your models using all of the different colors that we went through in today's class and get them ready for 103B. Before we go, I would like to extend a huge thank you to our supporters on Patreon. It means a huge amount to me when you donate to Patreon, and at this point I quite simply could not afford to be making these videos without your help, so I really appreciate it. We have just passed a landmark on Patreon where it has become my largest income source, so congratulations and thank you, or congratulations to me, I guess. Congratulations to all of us. It is pretty exciting, which is good timing because there's not a lot of other work available to me right now due to the current world situation. So if you'd like to see your name up here, if you'd like me to send you miniatures in the mail, or if you'd like to just send me some love, you can do so at patreon.com/Dana Howell. You can also follow my daily painting updates on Twitter and Instagram at Dana_Howell. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next class when we're going to be finishing up our Stormcast Eternals.